Thank you, and good morning. Today, I'm going to talk about accessibility, because that's what I do, and drinking tea, because I'm British, and that's what I do. So I want to take you back to look a little bit at some history, look at CSS and how it affects accessibility, take a little bit of a look at something that's a bit more speculative in CSS and accessibility as well. So to kick things off, how many of you remember a movie from way back in 1996 called Space Jam? Okay, more of you than I thought might remember. Okay, the reason I want to talk to you a little bit about Space Jam is because, by some miracle, the website from 1996 is still up on the internet. It's still there, you can see a picture of it. It's got this kind of star background and some icons going around in a circle. It's all very pretty, but if we take a look under the hood, it's all pretty horrible. Because in 1996, at least in the early part of the year, we didn't have CSS. So what we did have was a whole bunch of really, really horrible HTML, or at least horrible to us now. That was where we did all our styling. So if we look at the body element in the Space Jam website, we're going to see all kinds of attributes for styling links, be they active, visited, or otherwise, putting in the background color and a whole bunch of other bits and pieces. If we look a bit closer, we can see some brilliant formatting, center element. Anybody remember those? And the no break element, so that you could force content not to wrap. And you can see kind of how rigid this is already starting to feel by our definitions today. Layouts, table-based layouts. They're still a thing, sadly, but fortunately not as bad as they used to be. So we've got set widths, we've got alignment within table cells, all done to create that kind of circular icon pattern on this website. We've got font elements. In the case of the Space Jam website, they're just using it to fix the size of the font, but actually back in the day you could use it to set the font face and the font color. And amongst other things, this was all pretty horrific. Some of you, by the sounds of it, may well remember carefully putting together a website, getting everything the way you thought you wanted it, and then realizing that you needed to increase text size by 1 point, and having to go and change 4,000 font tags across the thing individually. And you can try kind of global search and replace, but it never worked for me, so, And there were also a whole bunch of accessibility problems with all of this. It was not possible to override any of these styles. So if you had, say, a visual impairment and you wanted better color contrast, or you needed a bigger text size, you couldn't really do anything about that. We didn't have much of a concept of small screen and large screen devices back then, but there were people who were using really large, by the day, and by the day I'm talking about probably 14-inch monitors, in a really low resolution to look at extremely magnified content because they were partially sighted. And these websites offered no flexibility in that. You just got what was presented at the width it was meant to be, and that was it. So along came CSS1 at the end of 1996, and it gave us the box model, some very basic float capability to start looking at CSS layouts, and a whole bunch of properties for looking at things like fonts and colors and link selectors for styling all of those. So for the first time, we all cheered because we didn't have to deal with quite so many font elements anymore. And from an accessibility point of view, we started to introduce the idea of separation of content and design. So it was possible to introduce more flexibility, the capability for a user to override styles if they needed to. It was still complicated, but it was possible. And so on that note, it was time for a nice cup of tea. The web all went off and thought, job done. Content and design are all separated. It's all nice and clean and tidy. Thank you very much. Meanwhile, some interesting things were happening on the accessibility front. Windows, Microsoft were introducing the first of the platform accessibility APIs. They're now available on all platforms, be it Windows, Linux, macOS, iOS, or Android. And in some cases, particularly Windows, there are actually 3 different platform accessibility APIs available. And what these APIs do is expose accessibility information about objects within the operating system or application interfaces. So, if we were to take a look at Checkbox, this one on screen is from somewhere deep inside the Windows 10 control panel system, and we were to look at it with one of the accessibility APIs available on Windows, what we'd find is some information like the following. We'd discover that this object has a role of checkbox. That's its thing, that's its purpose, that's what it does. It has a label, or an accessible name of bold. That's the visible text label. It's the thing that tells us what this checkbox does as opposed to any other checkbox in the interface. And lastly, we can find out something about its state. It can be focused on, it is focused on at the moment, and it's also checked. The interesting thing is, if we were to try and create that same checkbox using pretty standard HTML, an input type of checkbox, and an associated label element, we discover that the information available through the API on that same platform is exactly the same. It has a role of checkbox, a label or accessible name of bold, and the state information is pretty much identical. This all happens in the browser because when the browser gets some code served up, it creates the DOM tree. I'm pretty sure you're all fairly familiar with that. What you might not know is that the browser also creates an accessibility tree. It grabs a bunch of the information from the DOM and creates a whole bunch of accessibility objects, and it puts them in a hierarchical tree that pretty much represents or mirrors the information that's in the DOM. But this tree is specifically intended to be queried with the platform accessibility APIs by assistive technologies, like screen readers, speech recognition tools, screen magnifiers. And in this tree, you'll find information about the role, the state, the accessible name or the accessible description of each of the objects within the web page. So when we manipulate the DOM, this is what happens. The browser creates the DOM, it creates the accessibility tree. That gets updated in response to user interaction or perhaps by scripted activity. As soon as the DOM gets updated, the browser updates the accessibility tree, and assistive technologies through the APIs are listening for change events in the accessibility tree, and when they recognize that something's happening, they take that information and make it available to users. So in other words, the DOM is incredibly important in terms of accessibility for assistive technologies that use the APIs. So a quick example here, just a really standard link. If you're not familiar with this, then you are probably at the wrong conference. The reason I want to show you this, though, is because I want to show you how it works with a screen reader. Now, you have to bear with me because I need to swap audio sources, so close your ears because this is probably going to screech at you. Oh, okay, that wasn't too bad. What I want to do now is just play this so you get to hear what a screen reader makes of that code. Okay, we would. Do we have any?
Page up.
Oh, have I? Oh, sorry.
HTML screen reader demo.
There we go. Let's try that again. Thank you.
Page down.
Tab, Tequila, link.
So that was just the tab key being hit. So a screen reader will typically echo the key when it's used, and then it just said Tequila, because that was the link text or the accessible name for the link, and then it identified it as a link. So all that information was just picked up by the browser from the DOM, converted into the accessibility tree, and taken from there by the screen reader, just for using basic HTML.
Page down. HTML.
So I'm going to give you a quick example here of how it works, just to give you a better sense of it.
Page down.
Link heading level 1. Proposed Aria password role heading level 2 link. Using the Aria application role heading level 2 link.
So that's just a screen reader going through a web page by headings. Screen readers have lots of shortcuts to let you navigate by different elements, which is another reason why the core HTML is so important. But there, you might have heard it was telling you that there were different headings, reading out the text of the heading, the level of the heading, and because these headings happen to have links wrapped inside them, that information was being made available too. And again, that's all just there from the HTML and from the DOM. So bear with me just a second. Okay. So, while all that was happening on the accessibility front in browsers and at the operating system level, CSS2 arrived on the scene. First edition in about 1998, but it was revised a little bit later. And the really interesting thing from an accessibility point of view here was the introduction of the before and after pseudo-selectors. So we have an after example, just really simple, adding in some additional text into the link we looked at before using the after selector.
This is the rendered code, so the accessible name, the content of the link, is still exactly the same as it was without the CSS. So that's pretty much what's happening in the DOM. Here's what the spec says about generated content in CSS. Basically, it doesn't make it as far as the DOM. Can you see an accessibility train crash starting to happen here, maybe? You might be surprised, though, so if I switch this back over. Who thinks this is going to read the rendered content? Can you shout out? Yeah. Who thinks it's going to do something really sensible and read out the CSS content too? Anybody going to buy me a drink on the outcome of this one? Okay, let's go.
Tab, Tequila, makes me happy, link.
So, against all the odds, screen readers read out the generated content as well. And it surprised me when I discovered this, because I really wasn't expecting it either. But it actually turns out that in all current browsers, the CSS generate content is available in the accessibility layer. I've included Edge on here, but I will put the caveat in that that's of Edge 14, which is currently only in the insider preview, but it's coming in the next couple of months. But otherwise, all browsers except for Internet Explorer pretty much take care of business. And the reason that they do is that they bypass the DOM on the accessibility front. So they just add the information about the CSS-generated content straight into the accessibility tree. They all do it in slightly different ways, but the essential idea is that they add the text, in this case, as a text node within the accessibility tree, and that gets picked up as part of something called the accessible name and description computation, which is basically how the browsers work out the accessible name for something or its accessible description. If you're really brave, go take a look at the spec. Take a drink with you, because it hurts, I warn you now. And there are people in the audience I know who will feel that pain more than others. So again, it was time for a nice cup of tea. We've got a CSS potential accessibility disaster that's been diverted, and it's all looking pretty good. Unfortunately, there is less good news on the way. CSS FlexBox. Who's really happy about CSS FlexBox? Quite rightly, because it's brilliant. It's solved a whole bunch of problems. Mostly, no more hacking floats to get layouts. I mean, just how awesome is that? It was 2000, I think, the last time that I put any CSS into serious action, and even I'm happy about the prospect of not having to do that anymore. So let's take a really simple example, just a series of 3 buttons straight after each other in the DOM. This is what happens in terms of the keyboard sequence, so the order in which someone would use the tab key to move through those 3 buttons if they were presented per the previous code. So everything pretty much according to plan. We have 3 buttons, 1, 2, 3. They appear on screen, 1, 2, 3, and the keyboard user hits them, 1, 2, 3. That's the last time it stays simple. We add in the FlexBox properties, so we stick in a display of flex on the container, and then we use the order property to start mucking around with the visual order of the 3 buttons. And we'll just do something pretty simple. We'll put them in reverse order. So in the DOM, they're still 1, 2, 3. Visually, they are going to be 3, 2, 1. And pretty much, you can see this coming, the inevitable happens. Sighted keyboard users are going to start to get really confused because everything's moving in the wrong direction. Now, in a simple 3-button example like this, it's probably manageable. But if you're using FlexBox to control the entire interface for, say, an email application or anything remotely complex, and we start using this and putting things in a really peculiar visual tab sequence, things are starting to get really, really difficult if you're a sighted keyboard user. Here's what the spec says at the moment. It basically says if you want to use FlexBox, you shouldn't use it if the order of content is important from an accessibility point of view. Which is kind of right, but you know what? This is FlexBox. This solves so many problems. So to try and advise developers against using it in certain circumstances for accessibility, much as I would love it to happen, it's just not going to wash. We live in the real world, and people are going to go ahead and use this. So we need to look for some better solutions. How can we carry on using FlexBox and also solve the kind of keyboard disconnect problem? One possibility that is often suggested is using the Tabindex attribute. You can use Tabindex in a bunch of different ways to control content. If you give an element a tab index of 0, it'll make something that isn't focusable, like a span or a div. It'll make it focusable at the point where that element appears in the DOM. If you give it -1, it'll take it out of the keyboard sequence altogether, but you can still focus on it programmatically with scripting. And the one that we'd have to use in this case would be a positive number, 1, 2, or 3, to control the tab index. And generally, that's never a good idea, because you're imposing a keyboard sequence on users. You're also putting a development overhead in place. Counting isn't difficult, but actually if you're trying to control the tab sequence through explicit numbering in the code, and then you later want to change that interface, move things around, and reorder it, you've got a headache just waiting to happen from a development point of view. So if we look at a quick demo where we've got the tab index used to try and mirror the FlexBox interface order. No, it's not so bad. It appears to work. But the problem is that that's all right for one example where you've just got 3 buttons in the middle of the page. But I don't recall the last time anybody just stuck 3 buttons in the middle of the page and hoped for the best. Again, we've got this problem where once you start to force a tab order, you've got to do it for the entirety of the interface. You've literally got to control the tab index of everything, focusable natively or not. And that's a major headache. So tab index works in isolation, but the web isn't something that happens in isolation. So sadly, tab index really doesn't help all that much. The other possibility that's suggested is an Aria attribute called AriaFlow. It's designed to create an alternative navigation mechanism. Now, in the present moment in time, Aria is pretty much only supported by screen readers. So if you use AriaFlow, problem 1 is that you're setting up a navigation specifically for screen reader users. The irony is that most screen reader users can't see the visual order, so probably don't care which bit they're getting to first anyway, in compared to how it looks on the screen. It's also true to say that AriaFlow 2 is not particularly well supported by screen readers anyway. But this is something of how it would work. You would have to put AriaFlow 2 on each of the different button elements and basically just do some horribly dirty hacking to try and simulate something roughly approximating the right keyboard sequence for screen reader users. So this works, but only if you are shift tabbing to go back through the page. And I'm going to use this with a bit of sound because I also want you to hear what a terrible experience it is from a screen reader user's point of view. And you can tell me whether you think you would want to interact with stuff on this basis.
3 button has flows 2. 2 button has flows 2. 1 button has flows 2.
So as you tab through, you get told that there's a flows to, but to actually get the flow to work, you have to use a screen reader specific command to do it. So AriaFlow 2 sort of maybe might work if you happen to use the one screen reader or 2 that maybe supports it. From a development point of view, it's an absolute headache though, because you're introducing a 3rd level of navigation. You've got the visual order, the keyboard order, and now a screen reader order. So scratch that from the record. Oops, sorry. So there is one possible solution on the horizon. It's a bug in Firefox. And I have to call it a bug because they call it a bug, because what happens in Firefox is they do some magic pretty similar to the way CSS generated content is handled. And that's just tabbing through the page, perfectly normal, with a FlexBox ordered set of buttons. And the visual keyboard order matches the flexed order, which is absolutely brilliant. What Firefox does is in their layout frames, they take the information, make it available in the accessibility tree, and basically hijack the kind of tab sequence and make it all work. For the moment, they've got to call it a bug, though, because of that bit in the FlexBox specification that I mentioned before. Because the spec says that using FlexBox shouldn't affect the DOM or the way the sequencing works. At the moment, technically, what Firefox is doing is a bug. I actually think it's a brilliant idea because it saves users from all the pain of having stuff that looks one way and navigates another. It saves developers from all the pain of having to try and think of which way up is left and right and backwards and forwards and a whole bunch of other things. And it happens really seamlessly and it works really, really well. So I hope we'll see a spec change that enables Firefox to kind of let this one go forward, and the other browser vendors actually will pick up on this and make life easier for all of us. So, is that time for a nice cup of tea? Yeah, go on then. But what I'm going to do while we're having a nice cup of tea is talk about something a little bit more speculative. Who's heard of the CSS speech module? Yeah? So this is really old school, actually. It has its origins in the oral style sheets from back in, I think, the early days of CSS2. And it's a whole module of CSS that lets you create oral design to complement the visual design that we're used to doing with CSS. It's an interesting idea. You talk to some screen reader users and they screech in horror. I don't want some developer hijacking how my screen reader sounds. It's going to be horrible. I think actually it has a lot of potential, and actually if we really want equality, you guys get to look at some pretty bloody awful designs, I'm pretty sure. So there's a certain logic that says actually we should probably have to listen to some fairly awful designs in our time as well. You know, can't have it both ways, right? So it has a whole bunch of properties. There's the speak property, and this basically says whether a piece of content should be spoken or not. You can set it to basically on, off, or auto. The interesting thing about auto is that it ties itself to the display property. So if you've given a piece of content display none, that automatically will set the speak property to none as well. So it'll do what pretty much happens in practice now. If you give some content display none, screen readers will ignore it anyway, but this just ties that together. You've got a voice volume property, so you could set the volume, make it softer or louder or extreme points of both. So if you really wanted to get someone's attention, this is probably how you'd want to do it. You can see now why people are starting to say it's a bad idea, right? You can have the speech, the voice rate property, so you can determine how quickly things get spoken. And also voice pitch, so you can make things higher or lower, again, to suit the kind of content in question. Some are use cases for doing this. Things like if you had a news website, you could get news headlines spoken in a kind of more news-readerly kind of a voice. Terms and conditions, you could get it spoken really quickly in that high-pitched way they do on radio adverts. If you wanted notifications coming in, you could just use a different voice or something to add an oral dimension to that kind of visual notification. There is actually one screen reader, the JAWS screen reader, has a sound scheme that you can implement called Rent-A-Crowd, which does this on a very, very simple level. It actually just speaks things like headings and links and lists in different voices with different accents and bits and pieces, because it actually, well, A, makes things a bit more interesting to listen to, and also it's actually quite a good learning tool as well to help people learn about different types of content on the web. So I've got a speech demo. It doesn't really demonstrate the CSS speech, unfortunately, because other than a tiny proportion of this module that's supported in iOS and Safari, sadly, there isn't really much support for this. So this one is hacked together using the Web Speech API to mimic what a screen reader might do for these different pieces of content on the page.
This sounds normal. This sounds loud. This sounds quiet. This sounds fast.
This sounds slow.
This sounds high.
This sounds low.
So you can imagine, listening to a screen reader, it does get really boring because everything gets read in exactly the same kind of voice. It doesn't matter whether you're just reading about, some terrible news incident or, just reading your email and some spam. It all gets the same kind of monotone delivery. So, I think we could jazz things up with a bit more support. So kind of another call to the browser developers. If you're out there and you've got some spare time, take another run at this because I think it'll be fun. The last thing I want to just mention is just a way that CSS actually influences accessibility in a completely different way. There's a bookmarklet called Visual Aria. For those of you who are familiar with Aria, it's a very accessibility-oriented technology, and unless you happen to use a screen reader, the effects of Aria are otherwise invisible. You can't really see them on screen, and unless you're listening with a screen reader, it's very hard to know that Aria is there at all, let alone whether it's working or not. There's a tool called the Visual Aria bookmarklet, which uses CSS to style a page so that you can see where the Aria is applied. And as you perform different interactions, it'll update the visual styling to show you where your Aria roles are changing or states are changing, and to flag up errors. The CSS in it is not at all beautiful, I will have to say, but it's developed by a screen reader user, so I think that's entirely forgivable. If there's anyone out there who wants to contribute to this project, Brian Garaventa would sincerely appreciate some help from you talented CSS design people. But it's just an interesting take on how CSS actually can also help accessibility in less direct ways. And so with that, I think it really is probably time for a cup of tea, or maybe some questions from Stephen, which I'm scared about now. But thank you.
Do you want to join me over here?
Sure, can I leave that?
You can leave that there.
Okay, cool. Hang on.
So,
Thank you.
take you over there. So here's a chair.
I'm supposed to get on this elegantly in public. This is, there we go. Okay.
So you're scared of my questions?
Yeah.
Why would you be scared of
Oh,
my
I don't know.
questions?
Because you seem to think I hurtle downstairs with...
That scared me. Actually. No, thank you for your talk. We have quite a few questions. Cool. Some people are wondering how they can inspect the accessibility tree.
So there's a whole bunch of tools that you can use. Actually, a lot of the developer tools now in browsers are starting to introduce this. I think the Chrome dev tools or the accessibility dev tools, Firefox, the web developer toolbar, things like that will all let you do it. There's a tool that TPG, the company I work for, creates called aviewer, which you go to Paciello Group, PACIELLO group.com/resources, you'll find it there. That will let you look at the accessibility tree in Windows in different browsers. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of tools out there that you can use.
And what do you think about the accessibility audit in the Chrome dev tools?
They've got a little bit more work to do on the accessibility of the tool, but that's it's the way it happens. You know,
Irony.
I don't mean that as a criticism. It's, you know, like I say, we're all working in the real world, and you know, perfect is difficult to achieve, and you know, we're all on a journey. But I do use it, and it is really useful. So you know, I think it's a good tool to use, and the more people can just poke around and learn stuff using tools like that, I think, you know, the better.
And so what other tools would you recommend outside of the dev tools for auditing, automatic auditing of?
Sure. I mean, I use Firebug a lot for digging around because I'm a Firefox user by choice. In terms of sort of accessibility tools, my favorite at the moment is a tool called Tenon, which is, if you go to Tenon, tenon.io, it's an API tool that you can either just sort of point, it's got a web interface, you can point it at a web page and let it go away and check some stuff. But the thing that makes it really cool is that you can just build it into your build processes. So if you use Grunt or Gulp, there's tools already available. If not, you can just use the API to plug it in and do whatever you need to with it. And I think the more we can build it into our, you know, originating processes, the better it gets.
Okay. How do screen readers handle icon fonts that are using before and after pseudo classes? Like there's a popular one called Font Awesome.
Yeah, and there's been a thread on that about the accessibility of that, which I must admit I haven't kept up with recently. When you use the before and after selectors to do that, the screen reader will pretty much read whatever the characters that you're using to create the icon, if that makes sense.
So like A or B.
If that's what it is, yeah, absolutely. So I've got a demo up on one of my GitHub accounts that just uses it's a disclosure widget with the typical kind of arrow bits and pieces, and that literally reads out kind of double downward pointing arrow or something, you know, where you're using that. So yeah, they kind of work and they kind of get picked up. The best thing to do actually in those situations is use Aria hidden and set it to true on the span that contains the icon, because the screen reader probably doesn't need to know about that icon. So just take it out of the accessibility tree completely.
Okay. This is interesting. You were talking about order in FlexBox. What's going to happen when grid layout comes?
Pretty much the same problem. Yeah, which is why
But
I think it's a good one to
in
solve.
more dimensions, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. How do screen readers handle alternatives for icon fonts, like SVGs for icons, for example?
So SVG, if you just pull it in like an image format in that context, it'll treat it like sort of any other image. There'll be no semantic information available, so it won't really pick up on anything particular. So either hide it if it is just purely visual, purely eye candy, or think about an alternative text using Aria label if it's important content.
Okay. I'm accidentally tweeting back to someone who tweeted a question. Sorry about that. If we adopt the Firefox bug as correct, how would developers change visual order but deliberately keep DOM order for accessibility?
Oh, that's a good question. You probably couldn't, actually, if it did go ahead on that one, because you'd effectively have the reverse problem of the one that we have now. So your only option really would be to go down the horrible Tabindex route. It'd be interesting, whoever asked that question, could you come and find me afterwards? Because I'd like to find out what the use cases are for looking at it the other way around, actually, because I must admit I hadn't considered it from that direction, and it's worth thinking about. So yeah, if you would, that'd be cool. Thank you.
Okay, and we have to handle one of these kind of questions. How can I convince stakeholders?
Don't. Actually, here's my advice. Just go ahead and do it anyway. Seriously, absolutely. There's one thing I'll actually guarantee you. If you sneak in some accessibility without telling you, nobody will pick you up on it. I pretty much guarantee it. With the possible exception if you do some riotously huge changes to their color palette, they might notice. But the rest of it, just go ahead and do it. Sod the bean counters. You guys are the power, actually. I think you need to know that if you don't already. You can accomplish a great deal by getting this right from your point of view. And you can also kind of, make the culture right. Because if your project managers, your managers, all see you kind of treating this as an important part of your toolkit, along with, privacy, security, quality, usability, resilience, a whole bunch of other bits and pieces, then slowly but surely they will get the idea that that's the way they need to think about it too. So you guys have the power, so use it.
And arguably, a lot of small things you could do aren't very difficult to implement, right?
Right.
To make things accessible.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So no one has to know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It's our own dirty little secret. Let's see here. We have time for a couple more. In a site with navigation visually in the second row, we put it in the first HTML. I have to understand this myself. Hold on. In a site with navigation visually in the second row, we put it in the first HTML row and moved it to the second using flex order. Good? I'm having trouble understanding that question, but maybe that's because I'm reading it.
Does maybe count as an answer? It depends what's actually in the first row. If there is focusable content in that first row, it's a bad idea. If there isn't, you can probably get away with it. So the flex thing is really only a problem if you see something and you use a keyboard to navigate. So if you see your content in your first row, oh no, hang on, sorry. If the content in the first row, which visually is the second row, try doing this when you can't see, trust me. If that has focusable content in, then a sighted keyboard user is going to tab. They're going to tab through what is the first row in the DOM, but the second row visually. And then their tab order is going to go back up to the top of the page visually, which is the second order in the DOM, which is going to start to get confusing, because once they've gone through the navigation, their next tab stop is going to be presumably after that next row and back down into the content. So their tab sequence is going to kind of go through the second row, through the first row, and then back down to the content, which is going to start getting a little bit complicated if you're not careful. But yeah.
Sounds like a maybe.
Yeah. Can I have a drink now?
A cup of tea.
Yeah, obviously, yes.
How many of the assistive technologies read generated content? If you put all of them in a basket.
I haven't tested all of them, but as far as I'm aware, most recent versions of most screen readers do handle it. Because now, more than ever before, the screen readers are dependent on what the browser does. So if the browser does something, then there's a good chance that the screen readers will. So as far as I know, it's got pretty good support.
Okay. I want to thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it, and
Cool.
I'm sure everyone else did, so thank you.
Cheers, Stephen. Thanks, everyone.